On behalf of the Kellogg Institute, I am very pleased to welcome Alisha Holland, the Gates Professor of Developing Society and Government Department at Harvard University. Alisha, as many of you know, and see through this great turnout, is a leading scholar of the political economy of development. Her work on social policy, urban politics, immigration, and corruption has not only been published in every top journal of political science, but it has really shaped the way that we think about these issues. Probably the best example of Alisha's wide influence in this discipline comes from her award-winning book, Forbearance and Redistribution. The book really challenges what had been the prevailing wisdom of the time, that the lack of regulatory enforcement was due to weak state capacity. And she argued instead that it was driven by the electoral and distributive preferences of politicians. And this opened up new theoretical and empirical avenues for the studies of the political economy of development. Today, she's going to be presenting her new and extremely timely project on why infrastructure projects may not always have the intended developmental consequences, which I am sure will also influence the way we think about the politics of infrastructure and the way that this issue is studied in political economy. So please join me in giving a warm welcome.
Thank you for that extremely generous introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here with old and new friends and colleagues. And I always tell my students not to try to present their entire dissertation or their entire books. And I'm going to defy my own rule and try to give you a sense of this book project today. And we'll see how it goes, but I'm excited to get to share what hopefully will be a book coming out pretty soon. So, because it's close to the Olympics, I will say that I used to be a figure skater. So you guys should all watch the figure skating, ice dancing in specific. And in the summertime, what I like to do is go rollerblading. So I first started thinking about this project when I was visiting my father's family in Panama. And I asked my aunt, is there anywhere to go rollerblading? And she said, try the highway. And I thought, okay, so this might be a Latin American misunderstanding of exercise. Rollerblading is not a common sport. But she said, no, there's no traffic. They just built this gorgeous highway by the bay. You can rollerblade on the highway. And so I'm going to see if I can use this fancy button. Oh, wow. Okay, so that's my husband rollerblading on the Cinta Costera in Panama City. And this is a highway with basically no traffic. As I was rollerblading, I started to think about, why did the government build this highway? It was also a fascinating piece because this highway was not finished under the president who started it. Panama, like many Latin American countries, has a very weak political party system. So the president and the party had changed office by the time this was inaugurated. And I could tell the same story about many of the infrastructure projects happening in Panama at the time. So this is the Panama City Metro, again, a project that was started under a president who didn't finish it. And this raises a kind of fundamental question for political scientists, which is really, why do politicians invest in long-run projects that they won't be able to open? So we think that politicians invest in infrastructure because they're able to cut the ribbon and inaugurate the projects and hold big ceremonies. And yet we see a lot of infrastructure projects that aren't done under the party or president who started. And I think the secondary question is also, why invest in projects that voters don't use? So if you're going to build something, don't you want to build something that people are going to ride and that serves more than rollerblades? And this really fascinated me in part because I came from the US where, there's been a long discussion about why the US is unable to build infrastructure. This is actually a much broader story when you look at advanced industrial democracies. So what I'm plotting here is just infrastructure investment as a share of GDP. And what you see is that pretty much since the post-World War II period, it's been a story of declining investment for advanced industrial democracies. Now, you see a very different pattern when you look at developing democracies. So looking at that same measure for developing democracies, what you see are actually pretty big booms in infrastructure construction. Roughly 2000 to 2020 saw most governments in the developing world investing in infrastructure, and even more interestingly, I would say, investing in large-scale infrastructure. So you saw more subways built in that 20-year period than had been built in the previous 100. You saw investments in refineries, dams, large-scale highway projects. And this is not just a story of China. This is also developing democracies that are investing in these projects. So how do we understand why democratic politicians are investing in large-scale infrastructure? To give you a sense of what I argue in the book, the core argument is that we need to think about what infrastructure is doing in politics. We've long had this vision that it's about inauguration and jobs and sort of the credit that can be claimed for actually building the project. And the first move I really make in this book is to argue, actually, we need to look at the contracts behind these infrastructure projects. And the financial and legal contracts give us great insight into the political incentives and also the institutional constraints on building. So to unpack that a little bit more, there are kind of three parts to this argument. So first, I think about the benefits of building infrastructure. And here what I argue, which is not a surprise if you've read about infrastructure, is that many of the benefits come from the discretionary allocation of contracts. And in exchange, politicians are often looking for campaign funds. They're trying to figure out how you finance democratic elections. And this provides a short-run reason why politicians are going to invest in long-run infrastructure projects. Now, again, saying that, corruption and campaign finance are behind infrastructure isn't really something new. But the other side of the picture is, how do they actually fund these projects? When we think about the United States, for instance, one of the main constraints has been trying to figure out how to actually get the budget approved for projects that often deliver benefits in the future. And here again, I think contracts are a huge part of the story, and particularly the way that financial contracts change behind it. So I'll talk a little bit more today about the rise of PPPs, or public-private partnerships, which are essentially financial contracts that ask the private sector to provide the upfront costs of an infrastructure project in return for the fees and fares and government subsidies in the long run. And what this does politically is basically allow a president to obscure the upfront costs of these projects. So this is inverting our common logic in saying that politicians are getting short-run benefits for these projects, and at the same time, they're pushing the costs into the long run. And they're also often able to go around legislative bodies that would need to approve the budget. Now, of course, then there's the question of, when can politicians make these maneuvers? And here I really think that we need to think more about institutions that oversee infrastructure contracts. I'll talk less about this part of the argument today, but the basic intuition is that we need to think about what I call inhibitory institutions. These are the rules that allow state bureaucrats as well as civil society actors to oversee infrastructure contracts and oversee the construction process before it is done. And I argue that these institutions result often in what I call a kind of quantity-quality trade-off. So where you have stronger institutions, you actually build less infrastructure, but you build much better infrastructure. These institutions are critical for ensuring that infrastructure serves its development ends. So the punchline today is really that infrastructure can be perfectly compatible with electoral democracy. And in many ways, I think it's central to how politicians are funding their campaigns in developing democracies today. But at the same time, building infrastructure provides no promise of economic development or the social welfare benefits that many of us want to see from these. What I want to do is talk first a little bit about the broad research design of this book project, and then I'll tell you about the specific slice that I want to talk about today. So first of all, this book is in many ways an old-fashioned book, in that I tried to scale up and think about large infrastructure projects. This goes against a lot of methodological advice in political science today, which says scale down, work at small units of analysis where you could do, fancy statistics or run a field experiment. I do this because I think the politics of large infrastructure is fundamentally different than small scale projects. Precisely because politicians can't finish these projects in a single term in office. And also the sorts of economic and financial interests behind these projects are quite different. Now, at the same time, when you look at large infrastructure, you'll often get books about specific types of projects. So there are books about water and highways and refineries. I take the opposite approach. So I actually try to look across different types of infrastructure. Specifically, I look at highways, refineries, and subway projects. And the reason that I do this is because much of our intuition is that these projects should have very different electoral constituencies. Urban voters for subways, rural, small-scale producers for highways, etc. But they have a common financial and contractual logic. So my argument is that the incentives to build these projects are actually very similar if we look at the contracts behind them. What is going to differ is the institutional environment that regulates these contracts. And it differs most significantly across country. So I look at 3 Andean countries, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, that all have very different inhibitory institutions. Colombia maintains a long tradition of planning and finance institutions to oversee these projects. Peru has a much weaker set built under kind of neoliberal economic reforms. And Ecuador attacks these very institutions under a populist leader. This creates different institutional oversight bodies. They also differ a bit across projects in ways that I can leverage. So the core of the book are these sort of 9 case studies of projects across 3 countries. But I combine many different types of data sources. So I spend a long time interviewing politicians and bureaucrats and civil society leaders. I also include a larger statistical analysis of all large infrastructure contracts in Latin America, and also leverage many of the leaked financial and judicial documents that came out of the car wash scandals. Now, what I want to do today is first talk through a little bit what I mean by infrastructure. I think as political scientists, and I think even general audiences, we don't agree on this term, but I think it's really fundamental to understanding the politics. And I'll tell you that the rise of this term also comes along with a series of really important changes in how the state builds and what the political currency is coming from infrastructure. I then want to talk a little bit about the benefits coming from building these projects, and specifically this idea that this is a way to raise campaign finance. I'll give you a sense of this from some of the qualitative interviews and anecdotes from around the region and the specific mechanisms that are used to have infrastructure contracts fund campaigns. I'll then show you a small statistical test of how I think about discerning whether infrastructure projects are serving these campaign finance ends or more classic inauguration ones. What I do is look at the timing when politicians sign infrastructure projects. If politicians want to inaugurate projects, they need to sign a contract early in their term so they can inaugurate the project. Instead, what we see in Latin America is 2/3 of contracts are signed in a president's last year in office. You cannot explain that if they want to inaugurate a project. I'll then talk a little bit about the cost side. I'm first going to give us a sense about what PPPs are doing and make this argument that they're incredibly important to hide the fiscal costs of infrastructure. And I'm going to separate this out from other explanations by showing you what happens when politicians are constrained to put the cost of infrastructure on budget. So when governments pass fiscal rules that limit the debt or deficit, you see a dramatic increase in the use of PPP contracts. I'll then give you a more qualitative sense of how these contracts are manipulated coming from Peru's Interoceanic South Highway project. And at the end, I'll talk about the implications for how we think about democracy, liberal democracy more specifically, and also state capacity as a determinant of what gets built and what ends it serves. All right. So So let me start with some of the definitions. Take a sip of water. All right. So when I started this project, part of my interest was in why we're talking so much about infrastructure. You've heard about green infrastructure, care infrastructure, digital infrastructure. And yet, when I went to search for work, research, political science research on infrastructure, what I found were a bunch of pretty mediocre World Bank reports from the 2000s. And I realized part of the reason that I wasn't finding a lot of research is for most of the 20th century, we would have talked about public works. What are the political incentives to build public works? The term infrastructure really takes off in the 1970s and 1980s. And here I'm just plotting a sort of engram, so the use of these terms in books, and it looks very similar in English and Spanish. So what's going on here? Well, one of the quotes that I love that gets at some of the instinct comes from Thatcher, who's one of the main figures who introduces the term infrastructure into government documents. And what Thatcher says is, you and I come by road or rail, but economists travel on infrastructure. And so what's being captured here is, in many ways, the projects that are in my book, at least, are classic public works. Roads, refineries, highway, subways, trains. These have been built for decades. But the model through which states build infrastructure and economic theory around these projects starts to change pretty substantially as we go from talking about public works to infrastructure. So public works, the definition that I use to think about the projects in my book, really have two components. So the first is that these are physically situated projects. These are projects that have a geography that often require land to build. And that creates a very distinct politics compared to, say, public goods, which we think of as non-excludable. You can't keep people out. You can't charge people for their use. And also it generates a distinct fiscal structure. So these are projects where the economist Harold Hotelling would say that the average cost exceeds the marginal cost. Now, to take that out of economics speak, basically what it's saying is that these are projects with a high capital cost. You have to invest in actually building them, and many of the returns to them are going to come over time in ways that the users can't pay. So this creates a geographic challenge to building infrastructure, and it also creates a fiscal challenge to building infrastructure. Now, along with this shift, though, the real thing that changed was not this definition of what was being built. We can obviously think about how to put digital infrastructure in here and whatnot. But what I would argue changed is really the role of the state. So for most of the 20th century, when you were talking about public works, you were in a Keynesian world where the goal of building public works was to employ people. It was to create construction jobs. And you can see that when you look at ministries of public works for most of the 20th century. The state was building and directly hiring workers. So for instance, and I should say this data was first collected by my wonderful research assistant at the time, which shows you how long I've been working on this book, Madai, who's sitting in the first row. So Madai, who had to go and look at all of the employees at the Ministry of Public Works throughout time, what you see is, in the 1980s, the Ministry of Public Works in Peru employed more than 50,000 employees. And if you take the skilled employees, can you guess what the main profession was during this period? Madai knows, you can tell me.
Engineer?
Yes. So they were civil engineers. The ministry owned bulldozers, it owned heavy machinery. It was actually building roads, schools, hospitals, and so on. Now, we all know the story of neoliberal reform and this idea that the state shrunk, right? And you can see this in the data. By the year 2000, the ministry employs less than 10,000 people. But the state also fundamentally transformed. So if you look at the Ministry of Infrastructure today, can you guess what the main profession is? I heard it. Lawyer. Lawyer, exactly. What's happening at the ministry is you have a bunch of lawyers who are writing contracts to get private firms to do the same work that was done in-house. And you can see this, it's not perfectly comparable data, but in the share of GDP that starts to go to expenditures on contractors. So it was basically nothing. Data wasn't even collected for most of the 1980s and 90s. But in 2000s, you see the shares start to spike. That Peru is spending more than 1% of GDP just on infrastructure contractors. What the state is doing is basically building the same things it was building before, but hiring private firms to do the work. Now, why does this matter politically? Well, the currency of politics changed, right? What politicians used to have were jobs to give out to their friends to hold political parties together. What they have today are contracts. And so I want to talk now about the benefits that come from infrastructure contracts and how we can understand how these contracts are used. So as we make the shift from jobs to contracts, you start to see that we should be seeing different patterns in how these contracts are actually given out. So if you buy the sort of traditional view, which is what politicians want to do is inaugurate projects, or maybe along with inauguration, employ a bunch of their supporters on these projects, well, they need to sign contracts early in their terms in office. And so what you would expect is this electoral cycle where you sign the contract and then you open the project when you're running for re-election. In contrast, one of the ways that I distinguish my theory and distinguish this idea that what contracts are doing is really providing campaign finance or kickbacks is to look at the timing, and more specifically to predict that if you're trying to raise campaign funds, you might want to sign a contract when you're on the campaign trail, when you need to make a link to a business person to fund your campaign. And so specifically what I'd expect to see is that in countries with re-election, we see a sort of spike in contracts right prior to re-election. And that should be much more notable when you have re-election. So how do I see this more qualitatively? Well, you can also try to understand how these contracts are being used. And one of the things I do is really use some of my qualitative interviews to understand how do you actually raise campaign funds through these contracts. And I kind of break down 3 different ways in which you can raise funds. So the first is this kind of classic idea of a rebate. So one of the things that often happens when you allocate a government contract is that you'll give an advance on the contract. So I am going to pick Laura to build my highway. Well, Laura needs to go buy cement. She needs to hire construction workers. So I'm going to give her some share of the contract as an upfront payment. But now I'm going to say, Laura, if I give you that contract, I'm on the campaign trail. I need to win, right? So why don't you just give me some cash back now? You know, we'll inflate the contract a little bit and you give me some money for my campaign. So I'm using state money to funnel money back to me, right? And this you could see, for example, in the green rights scandal under Correa. Correa has this great leaked set of email exchanges with a Chinese CEO, where he basically says, look, I'm running for re-election. I'm going to allocate you the contract now on the campaign trail, but I'm going to pay you in advance of 30% of the project price, and I expect that money back in my account. So that's a rebate, right? And that, again, rests on this idea that I'm giving out the contract prior to the campaign, signing that contract so I can get money back. Okay, so another way that you can raise funds is what we often think of as the misdirection. So in this case, what you have is basically, I'm going to give out the contract again. Again, a contract needs to exist for this logic to work. So you can't just be promising a contract in the future. And what I'm going to say is, look, these are big, complicated contracts. So Scott, if I give you an infrastructure contract, you have to run some public opinion surveys, right, to build a highway, understand if people want the highway. What if we also run some public opinion surveys to see if they want me as president? And you can bill that to the same concession, right? You can bill that to the highway contract. This is exactly what Juan Manuel Santos was accused of doing in his re-election campaign. He basically had one of his contractors that had a big, complicated, multi-part contract, just bill a ton of public opinion surveys and campaign materials to the infrastructure project. So again, this is not a quid pro quo where I'm trying to re-elect you so I get the contract in the future. These are cases where the contract has been signed and I'm taking money out for my campaign. Now, the last way and the kind of classic way that we think this occurs and politicians are raising funds through contracts is through kind of preferencing. So all of this means is basically I have many people competing for the contract. So I'm going to say, Kyle and Manuel, you both bid on the contract, but really, Kyle, come on. I need some money for my campaign. If I get the money from the campaign, even if you're not the competitive bid for the contract, I'm going to make sure that Manuel is disqualified and you win the contract. So basically, by shifting who wins, I'm then taking campaign donations to make that happen. So these are all ways in which contracts are used to raise campaign funds. And they aren't done so in the usual kind of quid pro quo where first the politician is elected and then, if they win, they give out a contract. Instead, what we're saying is you need to allocate the contract, and that's the way to raise funds, which is why you can get a cycle where essentially these contracts are signed just before an election. All right, so how do I test that a little bit more systematically? Well, what I tried to do was first look at the timing of these contracts. And so I built a database of infrastructure projects across Latin America. And the tricky part about this data is that, first of all, there's no agreement on infrastructure, which is another story. But even if we can kind of agree on the set of projects, and here I relied on a sort of private set coming out of Fitch Capital to identify projects, it's sometimes hard to figure out when these contracts are actually signed. And so what I had to do was go to each contract, go to each government, and look at the signing dates of the contract. And part of the reason is this is tricky is that there are all sorts of other dates floating around, right? There's dates when the first brick is laid. There's dates where we agreed that we were going to build this. There's dates when, the funds were allocated for a project. And so what I really wanted to see was when is there a legal agreement that this company is going to be the one to build the project. All right. And so from that, I then wanted to see when are these contracts signed relative to elections, right? And so I create this relative year variable, just trying to look at, how close to an election these contracts are signed, where my main prediction is you should be signing these contracts kind of the year running up to the election. I also needed to get data that looked at some of the institutional variation that might shape these contracting cycles, right? So obviously re-elections, or when presidents can run for re-election, we should see much sharper cycles. Also, you might think that campaign finance rules might shape the way in which contracts are allocated. So in the most optimistic world where you have more robust public campaign finance, perhaps there's less of a need to manipulate contracts in this way. So I got election data from the Baker and Green sort of data set. I used VDEM to look at campaign finance rules and whether countries had sort of robust campaign finance. And all I'm going to show you today are some very simple bar charts to get a sense of the patterns of how the number of contracts change depending on how close we are to an election. All right, so first let's think about re-election and what happens. So countries where the president cannot run for re-election, you basically see no cycle in contracts, which is largely what you'd predict. This is also especially in a context of weak political parties. But what you see is that when presidents can run and are standing for re-election, basically contracts are clustered in the 18 months before re-election. You see something similar if we look at the impact of campaign finance rules. So in countries that have robust campaign finance, which admittedly are a minority in Latin America, you see basically no contract cycles. But in countries that don't have campaign finance, what you see is a big spike in the number of contracts that are being signed, again, about a year prior to re-election. So again, this is evidence consistent with the idea that these contracts are being used to fund campaigns. And obviously, as well as funding campaigns, there's kickbacks. I'm not, underestimating the role of corruption as well. But because you see this variation with the institutional rules, we can gain a little bit of confidence that this is also being used for campaign purposes. All right, let me now turn to the cost side. So even if politicians get these benefits from signing contracts, they're able to fund their campaigns, they still might have to pay for these projects, right? And that could be electorally costly, particularly if they need to raise taxes or issue debt to fund projects. So I'm going to take us a little bit into the weeds of infrastructure contracting. I know this is where you all wanted to go in this talk. just bear with me for a minute. So even when we're in this world of contracts that are these legal documents, financial documents, there's different ways to structure an infrastructure project. The sort of classic way is what we would call a public procurement, or what was traditionally the public works contract. In this case, basically the government is going to specify what it needs to build a project. So I need X bags of cement, I need Y workers, I need Z engineering skills. And basically the government specifies all of these different inputs. It means that because all these inputs are laid out, the state can buy the inputs from different providers. This is what's often called an unbundled contract. And you can see some advantages, right? Like I can give Luis one little piece and Mauricio a little piece. Everybody gets a small piece, right? And one of the reasons that this is often favored is that the government has to pay for these little pieces up front, but it often can also kind of gloss over how much it's going to cost to maintain the project, to operate the project. So we often thought that one of the big issues with public works is that politicians wanted to inaugurate them, and then like who was going to pay to actually maintain and operate them. Now, these types of contracts are usually financed on budget because I need to pay for all of these inputs. I need to pay Luis and Mauricio for all the work they're doing. And that means that we're going to need some debt or taxes or something that's going to allow me to pay my contractors. Now, when I need to pay those contractors, it also means usually we're going to need Congress to approve the project and put that on the ordinary budget. Okay, that's the Public Works project. Let me talk a little bit about what happened with a PPP, at least in the infrastructure sector. So here the idea was, what if the state, rather than needing to lay out all of these different components, just came up with the idea of the project? I want to build a highway from point A to point B. Not going to tell you how to do it. I don't know how much cement I need. I don't know what type of skilled labor I need. I have the idea. And then you're going to get bids from contractors who work together, usually forming some sort of single consortium that's going to propose to design the project, it's going to build the project, and in many cases, it's also going to operate and maintain the project. This is what's often called a bundled contract, right? We're putting together all the different components and we're putting together construction, maintenance, and operation. Now, one of the main points of this was we're going to make the maintenance and operation costs visible, right? But the way these projects often were designed is that this single firm was also going to do the finance of the project. And so what you get is usually a consortium that's going to say, I'm going to put in debt and equity. I'm going to pay for some of the construction costs up front. And in exchange, because I'm operating the project, I'm going to collect the fees and fares and also get government subsidies once this is operational. Now, what I've just done in that project is I've made the investment cost hidden, right? The private firm is paying for it. The state is not paying anything upfront in an ideal type of these contracts. Also, in many cases, these are thought of as risk transfer agreements. So basically, you could say, okay, the private firm is going to build the project, and if traffic exceeds this level, then nobody pays. But if traffic isn't as high as we thought, then the government's going to pay. But those are all contingent payments, right? It's not clear how much the government is going to owe because that's contingent on what happens with traffic. And what that means is that cost does not show up on the government budget. It doesn't show up as government debt. And so what that means is that these projects are basically financed off budget. At least in year zero, it's not clear what the government is paying. And even by the time the project is operational, it might not be clear what the government's liability is. Now, the other key piece of this is because we don't need to pay anything up front, I don't need to take this to Congress. In many cases, these are financial deals where the finance ministry can directly approve the project. These are investment deals. So my argument is this changes the politics, the costs of infrastructure pretty substantially. Now, to give you one sense of how I can see this, I look at what happens around the introduction of fiscal rules. So fiscal rules are basically when a government agrees to limit its debt or deficit. Now, this is not a US-style fiscal rule where we just keep raising the debt ceiling. In many Latin American countries, these are really binding rules. So you can think of Dilma Rousseff, who went to jail briefly for violating this rule, right? The IMF is obviously very much behind these types of fiscal rules. It's meant to create greater responsibility. And what you can see is that this also really complicates the funding of large-scale infrastructure. So if you're constrained in your debt or deficit, you cannot put projects on budget very easily. And so what I do is look at the use of PPP projects relative to when a fiscal rule is passed. And so what you basically see is after a fiscal rule passes, there's this increasing slope where governments rely more and more on PPP contracts. Now, of course, you might say, well, the governments that implement fiscal rules, they're also right-wing, they're also in talks with the IMF. That seems like the type of government that would love PPP contracts, right? One of the ways I try to separate that is looking at what happens for new infrastructure, where essentially what a PPP contract is trying to do is essentially take that investment cost off budget versus PPP or privatization contracts for existing infrastructure, where what the government is trying to do is save money. So essentially move costs off budget. And what you see is that for new infrastructure, you get this big discontinuity where like there's no difference in how PPPs are being used prior to the fiscal rule, and then a big jump in reliance on PPPs. And in terms of kind of privatization or PPPs for brownfield projects that already exist, you see no real change when a fiscal rule is implemented. This becomes more common over time in Latin America, but there's no discontinuity around a fiscal rule. Now, let me give you a little bit of more of a sense of how this actually plays out politically. So I'll just give you an example for the Interoceanic South Highway in Peru. One of the reasons I look at this PPP is it's really the first in Peru to be used for large-scale infrastructure. This was a 1,600-mile highway project. It was meant to connect Peru and Brazil. It was part of this broader kind of regional integration effort. And this was not a great candidate for a PPP. So again, PPPs are based on the idea that fees and fares are going to repay part of the investment cost. The traffic projections, because this went through a relatively rural part of Peru, said that there were going to be like 88 trucks potentially in the first 10 years. There was nothing in this area of Peru. So you're not going to repay the contract that way. But at the same point, Peru had just implemented a fiscal rule that really meant that the government could not put the cost of the project on budget. So at the time, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski was the Minister of Finance. He then goes on to being president. But I can tell you the very funny story of when we went to interview him. He's quite a character. But at the time of signing this project, he basically explains, we do PPPs for the same reason that the Europeans do. You can't put infrastructure on the books and stay within fiscal limits. PPPs give you some financial tricks. And so basically, this is a way to both circumvent Congress and also to hide the cost of this project. Now, of course, it's kind of clear what's happening to a lot of the finance officials involved. But nonetheless, the president at the time, Toledo, is very interested in signing this project. So even as the Ministry of Finance sort of questions, how much is this going to cost Peru? He says, we're going to sign this against, wind and sea. And, he invites all of his buddies. Here we have Chavez and Lula and everybody at the signing 1 month before Toledo leaves office. Now, for those Latin Americans in the room, you're probably saying, wait, but Peru has no re-election. This is a case where the money went clearly into Toledo's pocket. But nonetheless, you see this cycle in contract signing. And what's amusing is that, despite the manipulations at the presidential level of this contract, Congress really had no involvement. So for instance, I interviewed then head of the budget committee, who basically says PPPs are free to the state. The private sector and the users pay for the project, so Congress doesn't need to get involved. But this turned out to be an incredibly expensive project for the Peruvian government. So it started with a budget of around $640 million. It ended up costing $2.5 billion. This was money that the Peruvian government paid for the project. But again, through this PPP structure, this was completely hidden from the legislature and meant that the government paid nothing upfront. All right, so let me try to wrap up a little bit so we have ample time for questions. So the broad question in this book is, why do politicians invest in projects that they won't finish? And again, I tried to say the sort of conventional wisdom is that this is very hard for democratic politicians. They don't invest because infrastructure has upfront costs in terms of taxes or debt, and then it has these long-run benefits for users. In contrast, I reverse the logic. I think in many democracies today, given the model of state that we have, what you see is that contracting out provides politicians with short-run benefits. They can pick who is winning these projects, and that is a very important political power. On the other hand, many of the financial instruments behind these projects allow politicians to shift costs into the future and shift them away from legislatures. I didn't get to talk about it today, but my broader book project then looks at how the strength of these sort of oversight or inhibitory institutions changes the politics of these contracting states. But just to wrap up, let me talk about 3 of the broader implications. So first of all, I think this project does have implications for how we think about electoral democracy and elections working in much of the developing world. So I was always sort of puzzled as a graduate student because you'd start reading literature from the 1980s and 1990s, all of which was about patronage. So really jobs being used to cement political parties and machines. And then in the 2000s, we had sort of a wave of books about vote buying, which is all about cash being used to buy votes. But where does that cash come from? We often don't have great answers. But I would say a huge part of the transition comes in this shift to a state that starts contracting out some of the most important goods and services. Politicians are raising cash through these projects that then can be used to buy votes. They no longer control jobs. Second, I think this book does have implications for how we think about liberal democracy and the challenges or potential pitfalls of liberal democracy. I didn't get to talk about this today, even though I know it's Hasmin's favorite book. But, when you think about the US right now, so much of the debate is about how administrative and societal involvement in infrastructure basically prevents the US from building. And what I argue in the broader project is that this is a really limited interpretation of the role of regulation and of the role of citizen participation. So what I highlight, and again, I didn't have a chance to flesh it out fully today, is that essentially these institutions that oversee contracting are incredibly important to ensure that these contracts are not purely being used to fund politicians' campaigns and pockets, but that are also checking that these projects deliver growth, deliver social welfare. So I think Latin America really highlights many of the risks of simply eliminating administrative and societal oversight. Lastly, I think this project does have implications of how we think about state capacity. So, still in political science, we talk about public goods, and we often envision sort of ministries directly providing public goods for their citizens. But I think in most contemporary states, what we have is this really interesting mixture of public and private provision. So many public goods are no longer provided directly by the state, but they also haven't been fully privatized in the sense of, a private firm that actually owns and operates and directly provides the service. Instead, what you have are these complicated contractual relationships where it is a government that is hiring a private firm or hiring private consultants to do a specific task. And I think this requires a distinct type of state capacity. that we don't theorize particularly well. But it's essential that states are actually able to ensure that contractors are building something that citizens want, and they're building it in a way that actually serves the public. So just to finish this story, when you finish rollerblading down this highway in Panama, what you'll come to is a monument to the Brazilian firm Odebrecht. Now, what's amazing about a project like this is it's not just that Odebrecht won this contract. Odebrecht proposed to the president the idea of this highway. Odebrecht won the top engineering award for doing such a sophisticated, expensive design across the Bay of Panama. And yet this is a highway where the main use is to go rollerblading. So I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions and comments.
Excellent. Alicia's going to be fielding her own questions, and for those watching on live stream, you can just put your questions in the box and Therese will let Alisha know. Thank you.
So our hands shoot up in the back. So why don't I start with you, and then I see Kyle over here.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed that. My name is Alejandro. I'm an assistant professor here. And I thought that your theory could also be used to explain unfinished works and infrastructure in developing countries. I think there's an agency issue with you change government, the government that financed the infrastructure project is no longer there, then the incentive for the firm to finish or conclude the project is gone as well. So you might expect to see a lot of inconclusive infrastructural projects if this is indeed the case. And the other thing that came to mind is, like if you consider Mexico City, for example, the use of infrastructure projects for political purposes there is not only to fund political campaigns, but I guess to signal that the incumbent party has a commitment to the citizenship in a particular way, like in the case of Mexico City, the Metrobus or the combined bus lanes are more often built near election cycles. So as to signal that the incumbent party will continue with this projects in the future. So I thought these are two things that you could potentially add.
Yeah.
That would be consistent with the theory.
Yeah. So those are great points. I think actually on the first point about sort of incentives to complete a project, I think PPPs actually create an interesting scenario where you often see higher completion rates, which we might think is, an advantage, but also a lot of private sector influence over project selection. And I think the higher completion rates come from two sources. So the first is that these contracts, and I don't discuss these dynamics, can be renegotiated. And so one of the things that you also see is that as soon as a new government comes in, they're basically facing the choice, do I continue, do I cancel, or do I renegotiate the contract? And usually there's enough scope for bargaining that they renegotiate. It's hard to get data on contract renegotiations, which is why I can't document those patterns. But what I would expect to see is a lot of renegotiations in that first year where you go into government. At the same point, because these are binding legal contracts, they're incredibly high cost to cancel these projects in a way that they really aren't for public works. So Mexico, the Mexico City airport is a great example where AMLO paid more to cancel the original Mexico City airport than the cost of building the airport. I mean, it was an insane move from any sort of financial calculus perspective. I think of him as a very off the line case, right? Which is clearly there was enough scope for renegotiation that he could have continued the project, gotten a kickback and, not paid the legal costs of reneging. So I think actually the incentives for continuity are pretty high with PPPs in a ways that you see much higher rates of cancellation for public works and kind of more traditional contracts. I think you're right about the sort of One of the tricky parts in this project is really trying to think about sort of scale and time horizons too, because I think the Metrobus case is one where like you actually can kind of finish the project during your time in office. And the question is, do you actually want to finish it, or do you want to leave part of it incomplete to create this incentive? And these are the kind of formal models of like, well, if it's not fully complete, then I make you vote for me because the chances I'm going to complete it are even higher. I've always wanted to test whether voters are really that sophisticated to be able to calculate the differential probability of parties completing an undone infrastructure project. But I think it works best for a slightly smaller project than the sort of large scale PPP contracts where you get that sort of manipulation of timing and then trade off inauguration against the kind of lock in of future voters into the project. But I think there's so much to be done in terms of testing the way that voters perceive these projects as well. Okay, so I come over to Kyle and then I see your hand.
So thank you for a wonderful presentation. So I was tantalized by the thing you sort of dangled at the end about different types of state capacity, and I'm trying to understand exactly what you meant by that. So I understand that democracies can build infrastructure, but they do the wrong infrastructure and it might be costly, or at least the cost may come down the line. If they have stronger inhibitory institutions that are kind of oversight institutions, they will rule out more of these bad projects, and the ones that they'll do will be higher quality, but there will be fewer of them. So you're suggesting that there's another kind of state capacity that's sort of like acceleratory state capacity. And by that, are you thinking about sort of like in-house engineering capacity and technocratic capacity that can sort of make these projects get off the ground more cheaply, or that can actually identify public benefits? What does the kind of like obverse of the inhibitory state capacity look like? And is that why, as an American looking at like Europe, or like Northern Europe seems better able to build public infrastructure than we are here? Do they have more of that? Is that what we're missing?
Yeah, so I think could you expand on this a lot? I mean, I think that, and actually I think this is also an area where like, there's much more to be done. But one of the things that sort of shocked me in working on this project is just how little sort of agenda setting capacity Latin American governments have. And what I mean by that is like, most presidents come into office and they have no idea what infrastructure to build. There is no infrastructure plan. There is no infrastructure bank. To the extent there is an infrastructure plan, it's been funded by the private sector. So like Colombia and Peru, the only infrastructure plans were funded by the largest construction companies in the country. And so that's what I mean of like, it's these companies are not just getting a cut in the project, they're actually picking the project and setting the agenda. And so I think one important twist is to sort of say like governments need to have enough planning capacity or the institutional structure to actually have a kind of long-term pipeline of infrastructure projects. And that's the sort of top advice if you look at Canada or Australia that builds, they have infrastructure banks that tell you, here are the next 10 years of projects, politician, pick from the menu that you choose, but these are all ready to go. So that's one type of capacity that I think actually would accelerate investment and is incredibly important to make sure these projects have some sort of development end. I should also say the US has no federal infrastructure plan. I think it's one of the reasons that, we struggle to build infrastructure pretty acutely. And there's questions about federalism and decentralization, but that's one type of capacity that I think could be acceleratory. I also think there are ways of designing inhibitory institutions to potentially do less to slow down projects, but I think that's where in-house capacity matters quite a lot. A separate part of this project kind of looks at the extensive reliance on consultants and outsourced evaluations, and a lot of political manipulation also happens in that process. So yeah, it's a great thing to pick up.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna go back there, and then I saw Laura and Scott.
Thank you so much. This is a really great presentation. I just have a conceptual question about the way you're defining public works. So as I remember, what I wrote down in my minutes is that it's a fiscally situated project where the average cost of the entire project is greater than the marginal cost for each user. I'm wondering why you're not incorporating something like an accessibility component for the public work, because I'm thinking of situations where, like, let's say a dictator expropriates resources from civilians, and so the average cost for the project work is really high, but the number of users is very low, and they're not paying from their own like private storehouse of funds. We wouldn't necessarily consider that a public work, even though in those situations. So I'm wondering why not like make it just add like it's also accessible to like large sections of the population, or maybe like say marginal cost per user like per capita, like it's the amount of the average cost of the project is more than most people in the area are willing to pay. Why not those sorts of considerations as well?
So one way I would answer that is in some ways like this is meant to be the sort of ideal type, right? And in a larger book, it's sort of like if you look at the definition of public goods, it's a very abstract, about non-rival, non-expedable. And so I was sort of trying to think about like, okay, well, what are the fundamental features that are different, first of all? So these are both often rival and excludable projects as part of the way I conceptualize them. But I also think that thinking of them in terms of their sort of fiscal and geographic structure is one way to sort of break that apart without getting into too many specifics of, who's benefiting and how much. I think also one of the things that I grappled with that I think you're getting at is, when I think about that geographic dimension, one of the things that's interesting is in this space, I both have projects that essentially involve very concentrated geographic benefits. So you think of, an urban subway where, Chicago builds a subway, but the whole state of Illinois has to pay for it, right? So that's one structure where you actually have concentrated benefits with very diffuse, let's say, tax costs. But then you also have the opposite scenario of, say, a refinery, which you build in rural Illinois and, delivers benefits to the entire state that's getting cheaper gas, right? So those are both cases where there's a geographic mismatch between the beneficiaries and the way that costs are distributed that creates, I think, difficult geographic politics, but completely flipped scenarios. And I think your sort of accessibility case has a little bit of that flavor too, which is like who's getting the benefits is disconnected from those who are bearing the cost. And we can think of that going both directions. And both of those being cases of infrastructure politics where the fundamental tension is around how to resolve that geographic conflict between the mismatch.
Okay, thank you.
I think I said Laura and then Scott.
You already answered my question.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
You're good.
Okay, Scott and then Hasmin.
Thank you. Excellent, really great project. I would like to hear a little bit more about your 3x3 chart, 3 countries, 3 sectors, right? So you've got 9 cases. What you've given us here is it's a great analysis with a pretty common story. So I'm just wondering, I think you alluded to the idea that you didn't find much variance across sectors, but I'd like to ask about that. And especially I'd like to hear about, what is the variance across your 9 cells?
Sure. So great research design question. So what I was actually looking for was within country institutional variance. And the patterns vary a little bit by country, which is one of the reasons I didn't quite go into it. But for example, subways are a great example where depending on the country, oversight and also the sort of contracting of the subway differs whether it's at the city level or about the national level. So for example, Peru, the subway is entirely controlled by, the president, and the oversight, the inhibitory institutions are at the national level. And so you get the same patterns of manipulation on the subways that you see with the highway project. Ecuador reverses that. So basically, Ecuador, we might worry, this is just a competitive authoritarian regime. Correa is distorting all these contracts. It's not really about the sort of institutional environment. But the subway project is controlled by the Quito mayor. And the Quito mayor faces the inhibitory institutions at the city level. And so actually, it's a quite good project in terms of quality, one that's slowed down kind of by the inhibitory actors. But it's that sort of reversal that I'm looking for, where you can't just say this is about sort of resource rents or national conditions, but instead the institutional features are predicting the sort of sector outcome. And the reason to kind of do this across infrastructure assets is I do think you have people who for any asset that I talk about will say, well, that's different because subways have the following capacity and, Quito, actually, it's easier to build because the soil is the texture of cake, and in Bogota is the texture of a swampy liquid pudding. And I'm not kidding, those are the types of things that come up. And what I want to say is that the patterns follow the sort of institutional setup rather than any kind of consistent pattern across asset classes. But it's a clunky design. It's imperfect. We can talk more about how it was added on to.
Thank you for this fantastic presentation. I wanted to ask you about this claim that infrastructure can be compatible with electoral democracy. And I wonder if you think that there are scope conditions to that. And what I was thinking about is there are moments when infrastructure is quiet politics and there are moments when it's loud politics. It seemed to me that a lot of what you're studying and what that claim is based on are these moments of like quiet politics that the PPPs make possible, right? And I completely buy that, right? You're putting it off budget, it's not under congressional scrutiny, and then you can have these dynamics. But so much of what we've seen in Latin America lately is that infrastructure became loud politics, right? And it was due basically to these corruption scandals coming out, but also due to kind of the empowerment of social movements that were heavily involved in politicizing and raising the salience of this. And so it's not just only the inhibitory institutions that maybe were the ones that were addressing the issue of corruption, but also it's this contentious politics outside I think how you're thinking about these inhibitory institutions that also matter. So I would love to hear your thoughts on whether that's a claim that mostly speaks to these moments where infrastructure isn't salient and that we have lately seen moments where it becomes salient. And then what are the consequences of that?
Yeah. So I probably should be more careful with my words in this, and that sort of emphasizing that it was compatible with electoral politics. Very much what I had in mind was the classic like time horizons argument, which is, this doesn't work in electoral democracies because time horizons are too short. Politicians aren't going to care about these long run projects. And that's just where I want to argue basically like, yes, they have a reason to care because they're giving out the contract and campaigns, being expensive kind of motivates that investment. I think what you're pulling at, and which is a broader kind of tension in the book, is where the kind of tension with democracy for me really shows up is actually these questions, which I love, like Theo Rio-Franco's thinks about how you scale democracy. Like, what is the level of government? Who are the interested parties that we think should make these decisions? And this is where I think infrastructure raises really difficult questions, because the more you involve local communities have a very geographically circumscribed view of what the costs and benefits are that often don't align with the national government. So that's one way in which, sort of it can become loud politics, where the more kind of citizen participation you have, often the more disconnect you have between kind of the national benefits, overall benefits of infrastructure and what actually gets built. So that's one way in which I think these projects get noisy. And then I think you're right that you're highlighting the second, which is basically like if you take my electoral argument that this is being done for campaign purposes and all of this kind of informal, which you could call illegal campaign finance, yes, this is, probably subverting the quality of democracy. There's corruption going on. And once citizens find out about that, that really does create a tension in the quality of democracy. So I think both of those things are important challenges of infrastructure and ways in which building these projects often, raise real democratic tensions about, the extent of deliberation we want to have. Should it be bureaucrats making these decisions or local citizens? Like, that's a tension. And also, once you expose the kind of reasons that politicians are building these projects were often based around rents, citizens are a lot less enthusiastic about the actual outputs. Okay, Anibal, and then, okay, I'll do this triangle here. Yeah, why don't you start?
Thank you for the presentation. This is super insightful. I guess I have two questions. One is, I'm very curious about the concept of inhibitory institutions. So what is it? Are they veto players? Do they serve informational purposes? Why is it that the companies need to pay to the president and the mayor at the same time to solve the problem? So what conceptually, what are we talking about? I'm really curious about that. And then the second question is, I'm really curious, is this a big problem or a small problem? In the sense that one possible interpretation is, well, infrastructure gets built, right? There are side costs to it. It's more expensive because they're paying bribes. Yeah. And occasionally you get the highway that you don't really need, but at the end of the day, you get lots of things done. So it's a kind of an extra cost or something that needs to be done, or this is completely dysfunction. I'm not completely understanding how big the problem is.
Yeah. Okay. great questions, things I've grappled with and still struggle with. So inhibitory institutions, I mean, part of the contrast I have in mind is, the idea of horizontal accountability institutions, but really changing the timing. So these are basically, to me, the most interesting are state actors that can intervene before sort of the damage is done. So you think of comptrollers, inspector general offices, sometimes ministries of planning, ministries of finance. Now, we might say those are just veto players, but I think what's interesting is that many of these actors don't have formal veto power. They're not allowed to actually stop the project, but they can delay the project. In many cases, they also have gatekeeping powers. So one of the most common designs that comes out of Thatcher in the UK is really cost-benefit analysis groups where, the Ministry of Finance has to analyze the project, and anything that isn't approved as, exceeding the cost-benefit ratio can't be voted on and allocated funds. So they control the kind of pipeline of what politicians can then choose from. So I think it's a little more expansive than veto players because a lot of the fight is about the timeline of these projects. And I think part of my project is sort of saying that there's power and the ability to control the timing of these projects. I also, and this is a little bit more slippery, try to think about how societal groups also can have similar powers. So like the classic example in Latin America right now is prior consultation with indigenous groups. So if you can allow citizen groups to basically infinitely delay the project, well, you've given the power to those citizen groups and they can basically veto a project, but it's a little beyond our traditional veto players. So that's the sort of concept I'm thinking about. Now, it's related to your second question that I think whether we think of this as a big problem or a small problem gets into how we think about quality. And this is something that's been very hard in this project. So on the one hand, you have quality in terms of the execution of projects. And usually this is measured in political science by what we can see, which is like overcosts or time overruns. And my view is like, if the contractor is stealing 10 bags of cement and the thing gets built, like, good riddance, like fine. We spent too much time looking at the 10 bags of cement and not, rewarding the thing that got built. But the second dimension of quality to me is this dimension of selection. Are you actually building a project that is economically or socially useful in some way? Now, of course, that's much harder to operationalize, and many times we only see it very much after the fact. Right. And so some of what I try to do is try to think about what was known about the sort of quality and selection when these decisions were made. And to me, that's when the most costly perversions occur. So like big problem, take Ecuador. Correa builds 12 hydroelectric plants in places that now with climate change, have you looked at the hydraulic projections, have no water. Ecuador is broke because of the infrastructure that he spent on. I mean, it was billions. So those are projects that are useless and, hugely expensive, and I think a big problem. In contrast, I think the highways, again, where 2 inches of cement was used when 4 inches should have been used, that's a small problem. And I think one of the challenges is most of our institutions are focused on the measurable small problem. If you think of comptrollers, they're measuring the highway cement, right. But how do we measure the big problem? How do we conceptualize the highway for rollerbladers or the hydroelectrics that don't operate, the refinery that never got built? And I think that's where Kyle had to leave, but this question of who's setting the agenda, who's making sure these projects have some economic purpose, that to me is the institution that matters most in terms of what infrastructure is doing in terms of its development.
Yeah. In your talk, you emphasized the timing and designing of conduct as evidence for the kind of process that you think is going on. I'm sure in your book you have other kinds of evidence to support that narrative. So what other kinds of evidence can you bring to bear? Do you bring to bear on this?
Yeah, so you're right that this is obviously just one observable implication. So part of it is what we learned from all of these judicial leaks. So pretty much every country that I study has had a series of pretty dramatic scandals that, you can get this back and forth on timing. You also have cases, if you go to smaller scales, for instance, there have been interesting surveys done of construction firms, like when are you asked to pay a bribe, right before the election, how often you contribute to campaigns, are you asked to contribute in kind, in goods, et cetera. So I think you get, some additional evidence from the kind of cases and the specific contracts there. Another thing that I look at is sort of who gets paid in all of this. And you see interesting patterns in terms of, the timing of these payments. So Odebrecht was fascinating in part because it basically was the first modern company that kept an Excel spreadsheet of all the bribes it paid, right? So it shows you when they were paid for campaign purposes, was it a politician that was being paid? What were they running for? So I try to use some of that data as well that I think provides additional confidence. But whenever you're studying something kind of informal illicits, there's limits to what you can show, especially through data. And so my strategy has been very much to kind of think of, okay, so if this is really what's going on, what are the things we can observe? And I'd also say I started this project even before Lava Jato had fully burst in some of these countries. And it was a blessing and a curse because when you do interviews after a big scandal, no one wants to talk. On the other hand, everyone wants to point the finger at somebody else. And so I did a lot of qualitative interviews with politicians and I find them useful, but it's also hard to know how much of it self-preservation in these moments. Release.
Yeah, thank you. This was fascinating. I think it's a very simple idea, but capture something that is super intuitive, right? A lot of what we observe is just they do things, and the motivation is not to just show the inauguration of the thing, but actually most of the public works look like following this logic. So a lot of the talk really, and I know how much of the book focuses on this, change in timing and this increase, right? But the levels are not low below, right? Like there is still a logic of public infrastructure construction that doesn't reflect this end of term logic. So I'm curious, if the relative role of these different motivations and what could drive them. I was very struck, and I thought was just brilliant how you kind of trace the history of things and kind of distribute the politics from patronage to electoralism. I think that's brilliant. But really the logic you're picking up is the latter. But I'm not sure the other logic is absent, right? I'd be curious if you could say something about the kind of construction that happens earlier on during the terms of incumbents, and in particular where there are indicators of different quality. And just one thing that I thought that continues to be relevant is that we still have a patronage logic to public works, right? For example, where public construction unions are strong, a strong motivation to build is actually to give them jobs for the voice. That continues. So is that still present, and does that account for complementing this logic? I mean, do you see variation across countries in the degree to which that countervails this? So I'm curious to get a more view of.
Yeah, they're great questions. I mean, I think one thing I would say is this is another area where scale really matters, right? And so I think in political science, we have lots of studies of very local public works. And one of the fascinating things about local public works is if you look at, spending on construction versus maintenance, many mayors love to spend on maintenance. Because what can you do in maintenance? Well, you can hire anybody off the street to go paint something, to go fix the flowers in the public square. You at least need construction workers if you're going to build something, and increasingly you need some sophisticated construction workers, right? So that's one inversion that I think is fascinating and does not map on to when you think about large scale projects, right? So I think many local mayors are still using these projects to hire their friends, et cetera. And I think their patronage logic makes more sense. These big projects, the extreme of patronage logic breaking down, and I didn't talk about it today, but are the projects funded by China. So what's happening in the Chinese projects? China is bringing all of its workers. It's bringing its companies. And you see, countries like Ecuador, where Correa's national rhetoric is all about revitalizing Ecuadorian business, taking people out of the shadow economy to real jobs. And then you have projects where literally every worker on the project is Chinese. So that's where you see the extreme of the patronage logic breaking down. And I think one dimension of that is sort of scale. And the other part of it is the sort of financial arrangements and your need for essentially off-budget finance versus, these distributed projects at the local level are basically funded through national transfers. And that's the logic in which you're not paying for them. So I think that's one difference. And then your question was about sort of the contracts that aren't ending-term contracts, and what do we see sort of motivating those? So one of the things I sort of struggle with in the book is like, there's also a real belief during this period that infrastructure is the growth strategy. And so one thing that I don't really capture is, a lot of this takes off kind of end of neoliberal reforms, senses governments are not able to take advantage of the benefits of globalization. How are we going to make firms competitive? How do we make our country competitive? We need better infrastructure, right? Because suddenly, once you've left the sort of world of just an internal market, it matters how much it costs to get to the port and how good the roads are. And so you see a lot of business firms actually pressuring as well for better infrastructure. And there's this whole rhetoric that becomes around infrastructure for competitiveness. What are the logistics costs? And I think you could rise, and actually I at one point had Madai sort of track this in newspapers, but attention to this logic of logistics and productivity costs. And so they're true believers that, infrastructure is the development strategy, that infrastructure is also going to deliver, votes and not just, campaign donations for the contract, but genuine support from a certain sector of the economy that's going to benefit from these better projects. That's the sort of positive spin for infrastructure, right? And then you're also right that, inauguration doesn't go away as a motive. And also we see it with Trump today, all of the obsession with having these things named after you, of your legacy. I think all of those things are there as well. And so I think some of the kind of, non-electorally, non-campaign finance uses are spurred either by, a real kind of development logic behind infrastructure, or some of the more traditional kind of inauguration, credit claiming sort of incentives, and exactly distinguishing those, I think, is tricky. Over there.
Thank you. I'm wondering about the selection of your cases. And if one goes to Transparency International, there are two outliers in that, that's Uruguay and Chile. The three cases you selected are all above 100. And so doesn't it make a difference if you study this topic in Latin America? Doesn't it make a difference to look at the difference in this respect?
Yes. So I did debate including Chile, and I think that, maybe even the concluding chapter will at least have some gestures at what holds, what doesn't hold. I actually think Chile is a case where a lot of people would credit these inhibitory institutions as being extremely strong. So historically, the figure of the comptroller was probably the most powerful in the region, and I think was really important for controlling the kind of quality of infrastructure.
The Chilean state does hire people who are high levels of engineering, and they have to approve all of these projects.
Yeah.
They got a proposal from China to build railways through tunnels, and they said, this is just basically SHIT. And so when you have a high, I would say a low corruption index and a high state capacity for developing infrastructure, then the ballgame is very different.
Yeah. And I think the other thing we say about the Chilean state, because Chile, it's sort of Sistema Nacional de Inversión, it basically becomes the model for pretty much all the other cases I study. So Peru copies it, Ecuador copies it, Colombia tries something similar. The thing that they don't copy is actually having a civil service run those institutions. Instead, what they have is heavy reliance on consultants who end up doing the cost benefit analysis. And that's how you get these cases where, I don't talk about it, but the Interoceanic Highway, it goes through a cost benefit analysis. And the consultant was a fly-by-night operation that was like Toledo's cousin, right? So you don't get a kind of real check on investments. So in that sense, I think, yes, Chile fits in the sense that it is a very high capacity set of institutions. And what I'd say is the institutions that really matter are these inhibitory institutions that I don't think we've spent enough time kind of theorizing and paying attention to. It's not that you're going to go prosecute after the fact. It's that in that moment, there actually is a set of skilled, trained, in-house bureaucrats who are evaluating these projects. So I think you're right. And I've looked at bits of the Chilean case, but it doesn't figure prominently.
And Uruguay,
I'm sorry?
and Uruguay.
Uruguay is interesting because I think, the puzzle that's raised by the two is Chile still builds a lot of infrastructure. Uruguay stops doing large projects. Its infrastructure is basically deteriorated.
It's this side, right?
Yeah, as well. Yeah, over there.
Thank you so much. I'm really curious to hear a bit more if you're willing to talk about kind of the early stages of the project. What did you come to the field with, your kind of theoretical priors, or what were you expecting to find? I think hearing the kind of the theory surrounding the rebates, the misdirection, the preferencing, did you expect this? Was that surprising? Just, yeah, a little bit more about kind of your field work and theory building process.
Yeah, those are great questions, but I suffered much of this. So, on the one hand, one of the things I really miss doing a second book versus my first book is that, I didn't have some advisor saying, what's your DV? What's your question? Only stick to that. Come on, So I went in with what was a very sprawling project is what I would say, which, was generally motivated by the sort of sense like there's vastly different levels of infrastructure investment. And I had, for my first book, I sort of ended it doing a shadow case of Turkey, which is another one of these like massive infrastructure investors where politics is basically, seemed like it was revolving around these large scale projects. And then, I would go to Colombia where they couldn't build anything in the sense that, it was impossible to build a democracy very much pervaded the country. So I began from sort of that basic puzzle. I think what was hard about this project was just realizing how much sector-specific knowledge was required, like figuring out what on earth was a PPP. And again, what I suffered through this, like all these terrible definitions and manuals and sort of figuring out like, no, but what's the politics of a PPP? Like, why would you do this politically? I think I went in probably with more of a sense that some of these kind of, what would I say, more sort of classic institutional factors like federalism would matter. Probably a little bit more of a sense that some of these issues around sort of re-election or no re-election would matter, but through these kind of inauguration type incentives. So I think that my sense of the institutional environment shifted pretty dramatically. And I think the turning point was really realizing infrastructure today, and this is a point made in the broader sort of literature on financialization, but many of these construction companies would sort of say infrastructure is not about building things. Infrastructure is about financing things. And I think that was a key shift that I did not expect. I really think I had much of the old logic of well, this is about, did you actually build the thing or not? And what is the sort of incentive when you have a sort of decentralized country to build or not build?
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. But this project obviously raised so many questions. So hopefully some of you might have a minute or two to chat with Alisha before she has to be off to lunch. But thank you so much for this wonderful presentation.